care about Hunter Biden specifically, they don't want the bigger story to come out. What exactly was Joe Biden doing with this quid pro quo?
I had a quick question, and I thought you'd be someone that would is perfect to answer, because since you debate these types of things all the time, I feel like you'd have a very detailed and kind of like resourceful answer that I could share with my friends and family when this topic comes up.
Okay.
So to me, it seems pretty obvious that the reason that Hunter Biden got the pardon from his father is because, specifically from the dates, right? This dates back like 11 years, this pardon. It feels like this has to do something with Burisma. And I kind of have a general understanding of what that is, but I was hoping somebody like you could really like lay out the facts for me, and I guess, hopefully the audience, on what it is exactly that Joe Biden is probably trying to hide here by pardoning his son for 11 years specifically. And I don't know, I just thought I would just sit back and listen to whatever it is that you had to say. I want to learn as much as possible about this, because I'm sure it'll be a topic that comes up in the future, and I'd love to be knowledgeable when I speak to my friends and family about it.
All right, yeah, that's a great question. So I am going to put together a video specifically on Burisma coming up here. I've done them in the past, but I'm going to do an updated one that hopefully will be roughly 30 minutes, have all the sources linked and everything so that people could go check out for themselves. So there's sort of two answers to look at this. There is the answer that
I'm going to hop out, all right, buddy? Sorry to
yeah,
interrupt
no
you, man.
problem, no problem. So
Thank you.
there were two sort of answers to what's going on in Burisma. One that I've talked about for years and years, and the other that comes from Mike Benz. Let's talk about the one that I've talked about for years. Basically, the story is this. Joe Biden, when he's VP under President Obama, is appointed the point person into dealing with corruption in Ukraine. I'm going to try to tell this story with as many confirmed facts and as little speculation as possible at the outset here. And so everyone would agree Biden is working with the Obama State Department to deal with corruption in Ukraine. Ukraine has been known to be one of the most corrupt countries in the world. This goes back to the days of when they're part of the Soviet Union, and then after they get out of the Soviet Union, and it was known that there was a lot of like bifurcation. There were people that still lived in Ukraine that enjoyed the Soviet Union. There were people that despised it. There was all sorts of scandals, corruption, allegations of corruption that went on with the government of Ukraine. So let's move ahead to 2014. Of course, there is the ousting of President Yanukovych. There is a revolution there, the Maidan revolution that occurs there. And basically, maybe the United States was involved with that, maybe not. We'll leave that speculation up in the air for now. Nonetheless, a new president comes in, Poroshenko, and the Obama State Department is working heavily with Poroshenko, helping him create sort of their own version of the FBI called the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, the NABU. And that's being financed a lot by the State Department of the United States. And they're working in close collaboration with the Obama State Department, and in particular Joe Biden, to sort of weed out residual corruption that's there. One of the things that's being accused of being corrupt is there's a lot of publicly owned resources in Ukraine, particularly their energy industry. And there's a bunch of leases that are given out by the government to companies to drill. There are state-owned companies, but then there are also private-owned companies. And one of those private-owned companies that's getting these leases is a company by the name of Burisma. And it's owned by this guy named Mykola Zlochevsky. Mykola with an M. It's owned by him. And he is largely considered by the West, by the Obama-Biden administration, by actors in Europe, to be very corrupt. He's considered to be this sort of gangster-type guy who has connections to Russian oligarchs, who's basically scamming the good people of Ukraine. That is the official Western narrative on who Zlochevsky is. And he has been under investigation in Ukraine, and there's also an investigation going where assets of his were seized in the UK as well. And so there's this long-standing investigation going on against Zlochevsky. Meanwhile, there is a prosecutor, Yerima, I believe is his name, in Ukraine, who's basically doing nothing. He's tipping off Zlochevsky. He's not cooperating with the UK courts in their investigation, so the UK court has to unfreeze these assets of Zlochevsky. Meanwhile, in April of 2014, while this dude, Zlochevsky, is considered, and this company, Burisma, is considered corrupt, and Joe Biden's sort of the point person in dealing with corruption in Ukraine, Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, goes to work in April 2014 with Burisma. By the way, all of this is confirmed. None of this is controversial. Even the people that will defend Biden and Hunter will admit all of this is confirmed. And there were people at the State Department that had a problem with this, that said, look, this looks like a conflict of interest. Nonetheless, that's what occurs. You could speculate as to why Hunter Biden would be hired by a company like this. I don't think I'll admit this is speculation on my part, but it seems evident, and there's good evidence to back this up, that the reason that he was hired and eventually put in the board of directors was because of his connections in the United States, particular to the vice president. Nonetheless, what occurs is a new prosecutor is put in named Victor Shokin. In 2014, I believe Shokin's put in. There's still, at least on paper, an investigation into Burisma and into Zlochevsky. The Western version, the Obama State Department Biden version of this, is that investigation's going nowhere. Victor Shokin, the prosecutor, is corrupt. He's not going to prosecute Burisma or Zlochevsky. Shokin claims quite to the contrary, that he is proceeding with the investigation. There's a point where he refreezes assets of Zlochevsky. But certainly, I think the consensus would be it wasn't like he was immediately throwing Zlochevsky in prison. So there is some on paper an investigation going into Burisma. All of this that's the official story without speculation. So at this point, it then becomes, well, what was going on? In my opinion, what went on? Well, it seems that what happened was there was pressure from Zlochevsky and sort of people within Burisma to get Hunter Biden and his associate Devin Archer to get these investigations dropped. And in fact, the testimony of Devin Archer said that Zlochevsky basically said that he was under pressure from Ukrainian investigations and he wanted Hunter to call back home to Washington to get pressure to drop these investigations. Now, the official narrative from the Biden team is there was no investigation. But then why would Zlochevsky be pressuring to get this investigation in Ukraine dropped? Whatever the circumstance, around this time what happens is Joe Biden offers a quid pro quo, which he admitted on stage, that he basically goes to Poroshenko, the president of Ukraine, and says, we are not going to give you $1 billion guaranteed backing on this IMF loan unless you fire this prosecutor, Victor Shokin. Now, as far as I know, and I've researched this far and wide, and I've debated many, many people that disagree with me and are more defending Biden on this, I have not heard one time in the history of the United States where we have conditioned foreign aid on the firing of an individual prosecutor. There have certainly been times where we've conditioned aid on anti-corruption measures being achieved, but I've never seen a quid pro quo based on the firing of an individual prosecutor. And of course, what makes this even worse is this prosecutor was, at least on paper, and there's evidence to suggest even more than on paper, he was actually taking steps, was investigating Burisma and Zlochevsky, who is the company that Joe Biden's son was on the board of directors for. So in other words, our vice president went to the president of Ukraine, where Joe Biden was tasked with being the point person to deal with corruption, and told the president of Ukraine, you will not get this $1 billion unless you fire this prosecutor, your head prosecutor, who happens to be the guy who's in charge of the investigation into my son's company. Now that should raise red flags to anyone. We should not have major elected officials in our country using our tax dollars for the forcing of firing of prosecutors in other countries unless that are looking into their family members' businesses. We should not do that. Of course, the defense of Biden is, actually, this prosecutor Shokin was corrupt anyways, and everyone wanted him fired anyways, and he wasn't actually looking into Zlochevsky. But there's many problems with that. One, there's no contemporaneous evidence that anyone suggested firing Shokin from the West, at least anyone credible that's involved in, like, serious government, until October of 2014. Now, there have been testimony post hoc, so after the fact, where there have been people like Victoria Nuland that said, yeah, we wanted him fired as early as April. But none of their writings, they don't have it. We've seen tons and tons, dozens upon dozens of emails they've sent, of videos they've sent, of speeches they've given. No one ever suggested firing him. They talk about general corruption, but no one suggested firing him, and no one suggested a quid pro quo. In fact, to the contrary, we actually see in the month of October, we see some organization out of the EU said that Ukraine was doing quite well with their anti-corruption reforms and recommended continuing funding them. Now, in October, right around the time that we saw that there was emails pressuring Devin Archer and Hunter Biden, who were business associates at that time, pressuring them to get with their contacts in the United States with the goal of dropping investigations into Zlochevsky and Burisma. Again, their narrative is there was no investigation. Yet over and over, we see testimony and emails from Zlochevsky and his team saying, we need these investigations to be dropped. Why are they so worried about it if the Biden narrative's true? There was no investigation. So right around that time, we see them saying, contact your associates back home. There becomes this memo that's put out saying, we want Shokin fired. But no one ever suggested a quid pro quo with this $1 billion loan. In fact, I forget the name of the guy, but one of the people that's on Biden's team that's on Air Force Two, as Biden's flying over to Ukraine, says that Biden is the one who came up with the plan himself to issue a quid pro quo, which I've never heard anyone dispute. So we're told, remember then, when we get to the impeachment of Trump, we're told that this money going to Ukraine is very important. And you can't play politics with that because they'll accuse Trump of a quid pro quo, which he never did. But that's the accusation, that he issued a quid pro quo. And yet Biden, off the cuff, coming up with this quid pro quo to fire a single prosecutor, they're perfectly fine with. To further this, we have Devin Archer specifically says that several days before Biden would get on that plane to go meet with Poroshenko in Ukraine, they're at a meeting at the Four Seasons. Devin Archer, Hunter Biden, one of the head secretaries of Burisma, and Zlochevsky, and they basically say, hey, we're worried about this investigation. You need to call back home and get this dealt with. And Devin Archer says, I'm assuming the way they were talking, I know Hunter Biden made the call, and it was to his father. That's what Devin Archer has testified to. Now, Devin, under counter examination, admitted he can't be sure that it was specifically Joe Biden that Hunter Biden called, but he assumes that's who it was, based on the context that he saw. So let's back up. I know I'm getting a little detailed, so let's back up. Just make this as simple as possible. Biden's the point person dealing with corruption in Ukraine. His son goes to work for a corrupt Ukrainian oligarch. Not in my words, in the words of the Biden State Department. They're the ones that call Zlochevsky corrupt and Burisma a corrupt company. So the guy who's in charge of dealing with corruption in Ukraine, his son's working for a corrupt oligarch in Ukraine, getting paid millions of dollars. He issues a quid pro quo of $1 billion tax dollars of the United States to force the firing of a prosecutor that, at least on paper, is supposed to be investigating this. It works. The prosecutor gets fired. We're told that's fine because he wasn't investigating Burisma anyways. Then a new prosecutor comes in. Biden's team says he was good. This new prosecutor, Litsenko, one of the first acts he takes is ending the investigation into Burisma and Zlochevsky. Within 6 months, the investigation is dropped. Zlochevsky comes back to Ukraine, celebrates, and it's business as usual. The accusation is that the crimes that would take place, the reason, let me rephrase this. So there are all sorts of problems with this relationship because it's obvious that Hunter Biden is lobbying not just for a foreign entity, but one that's being considered corrupt, but he's lobbying. And he never registered as a lobbyist, which means that he has committed FARA violations. Even outside the context of it being against the law, most American people would not be too happy to know that their tax dollars were being used to threaten another country to fire a prosecutor that's looking into the vice president's son's company. They probably wouldn't be fans of that. And so this was all swept under the rug. Nothing really was done about it. Even when we had the IRS doing investigations into Hunter Biden, they claim that the CIA and the FBI was basically stymieing them. We're like, no, you can't look into Joe Biden. You can't. We had, what was his name? Oh boy, it's so bad. But on the eve of the 2020 election, one of the business associates of Hunter Biden spoke out about this. His name was Tony Bablinski. So he goes on Tucker Carlson's show, and then we have the laptop come out that confirms much of this. And you know the rest of that story. 51 former intel officials say that it looks like Russian propaganda. The story's censored off social media. Joe Biden goes on the debate stage and says, oh, this has been debunked. All these former intel officials say that it's just Russian. We now know that members of our intel agency were priming social media companies to censor this story when it came out. And then it turned out it was all true. Hunter then gets a sweetheart deal because once the evidence came out that it was true, well, now there has to be some sort of accountability. So Hunter needs to get a slap on the wrist. We, at the bare minimum, know he lied about his income and didn't pay taxes. Then there was this gun charge, which I think is kind of bogus, if I'm honest, the gun charge. And there's the obvious foreign lobbying charges. Then there's questions of, did any of this money directly go to Joe Biden? Does it even matter? To me, it doesn't. I could corruptly sell access as president or vice president, and not a dime needs to come to me. My son's more important than my well-being. So could I be bribed with money to my son? Why not? Whistleblowers start to come out and say, listen, we tried to look into this. The whistleblowers are alleged they're being retaliated by the IRS. And so with all of this, special counsel's appointed by Biden's DOJ, led by this guy, David Weiss, and they prosecute Biden on some of these, a couple of the tax charges and the gun charge, but they try to give him this weird deal, this plea deal, where basically he has immunity from like any other crime that he would have committed. And in my opinion, I said what was going on was they don't care about Hunter Biden specifically. They don't want the bigger story to come out. What exactly was Joe Biden doing with this quid pro quo? What exactly were the U.S. interests in Ukraine? They don't want that coming to light. So they don't want any charges related to Hunter Biden lobbying for corrupt Ukrainian energy oligarch. They don't want those charges. So they'll give him this tax charge. They'll give him this gun charge. He'll pay a fine. What's he care? There's a bunch of interests that'll pay the money for him anyways. He doesn't give a shit. End of story. Problem is, these whistleblowers come out complaining about it, and the judge that's in charge of the case is like, I've never seen a plea deal like this. This is crazy. So she starts asking questions. And then the jig is up because the prosecution's like, well, you know, we don't think this is like forgiveness on any crime other than these. And the defense is like, no, that's our understanding. So the plea deal's torn up. And inevitably, they charge Hunter Biden with this gun charge. Now, I predicted at the time, I said, they'll charge him with the gun charge, but mark my words, they will not charge him with the failing to register as a foreign lobbyist. They won't do that. They even put in some of the court documents about the gun charge that he was lobbying without filling out the appropriate paperwork in Ukraine. But they didn't want to charge him with that because the problem is, if you say, oh, Hunter Biden is guilty of lobbying for corrupt foreign Ukrainian oligarchs that are pro-Russian and getting paid for it, then the next question is, who was he lobbying to? Well, that would be our president, Joe Biden. In particular, when so much hullabaloo was made over Trump's connections to Russia. If Trump's son was being paid by a pro-Russian oligarch, and then Trump used your tax dollars to force the firing of the prosecutor looking into that company, what do you think the narrative of the Democrats would have been?